In an age where Europe bled under the boots of invaders, not all Vikings sailed west. Beyond the stormy coasts of England and the burning monasteries of Francia, a different story was unfolding, a story of ambition, of empire, and of transformation. From the frostbitten shores of Sweden, warriors carved new paths not through oceans, but through rivers, their dragon-headed ships sliced into the unknown, chasing silver, glory, and a place in history. These were no mere raiders. They were traders, kings, and mercenaries, sworn brothers in foreign lands. They forged Kievan Ruses from Slavic soil. They marched as emperor's guards in the marble courts of Byzantium. They sold fur and fire to Baghdad itself. The West remembers the raids, but this is the saga of the East. Before the Viking Age fades, before they vanish into Slavic legend and Orthodox ritual, we must journey along the Dnieper, the Volga, and into the shadows of Constantinople's walls. This is not just the story of conquests, it is the untold epic of how Norsemen shaped the fate of three great civilizations: Slavic, Islamic, and Byzantine. This is the Eastern Viking saga, and it begins where most Viking tales end. Before the name Russia echoed in the halls of power, before Orthodox cathedrals crowned the skyline of Kiev, there was a forgotten beginning. A time when Vikings, not Slavs, ruled the rivers of the East. And it all began not with empire, but with tribute. By the mid-9th century, the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe was still fluid, shaped more by landscapes than by central authority. Forests, rivers, and steppe corridors defined the rhythms of commerce and war. Into this space came the Varangians, a term used in the East to describe Norse adventurers, traders, and warriors, primarily of Swedish origin. These men were known to the Greeks as Varangoi, to the Slavs as Variagi, and to themselves as Varangians, a word that, in Old Norse, meant those sworn by an oath. Simon Franklin, professor of Slavonic studies at University of Cambridge, in his book The Emergence of Rus, 750 to 1200 writes, "The Rus were not merely interlopers, they became architects of a political system that would outlive their own cultural identity." By the way, let's explore shortly where the term Rus, a term foundational to the history of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, came from. The word Russes did not originally come from the Slavs themselves, but from the Norse. It likely stems from an Old Norse term meaning rowers or crew of oarsmen, and referred to Swedish Vikings who travelled the great river routes of Eastern Europe. These men were known as Rus by the Slavs, Ros by the Byzantines, and Alrus by Arab chroniclers. Long before the rise of Russia, these were the Norse adventurers who gave the land its name. The origins of this transformation lie in the river systems of Eastern Europe. The Volga, Dnieper, and Dniester were not merely natural features. They were highways, flowing from the Baltic Sea in the north toward the Islamic and Byzantine worlds in the south. It was along these routes that the early Norse settlers, later called the Rus, began to build their influence. The Primary Chronicle, a 12th century East Slavic compilation often attributed to the monk Nestor, recounts a key legend. In 862 AD, the local Slavic and Finnic tribes of the Novgorod region invited a Varangian chieftain named Rurik to rule over them. The chronicle states, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Though the historical accuracy of this invitation is debated, the political reality is clearer. The arrival of Scandinavian elites brought military cohesion, hierarchical governance, and commercial acumen. From their early base in Ladoga and later Novgorod, the Rus established a loose but expanding system of control over the Finno-Ugric and Slavic tribes of the north. Jonathan Shepherd is a British historian specializing in early medieval Russia, the Caucasus, and the Byzantine Empire. Regarding those events, he writes, "The Volga and Dnieper systems were not frontiers, but bridges, linking Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Caliphates. From Ladoga, Rurik's successors pushed southward. Around 882, Oleg of Novgorod, a relative of Rurik, seized control of Kiev, a strategic stronghold on the Dnieper River. By uniting the northern Rus's lands with this key southern hub, Oleg laid the foundations of a new polity, Kievan Rus. This consolidation was more than military. Kiev allowed the Varangians to insert themselves directly into the lucrative trade networks flowing toward Constantinople and Baghdad. The city became a nodal point between three civilizations: the Norse north, the Slavic forest zones, and the imperial south. Here, Byzantine silk, Abbasid silver, and Slavic furs crossed paths. It is important to understand that this state was not centralized in the modern sense. Kievan Rus was a confederation of tribute-paying principalities, loosely bound by blood, fear, and trade. Yet, its cultural and political influence would prove lasting. Florin Curta, professor of medieval history at the University of Florida, in his book The Making of the Slaves from 2008, writes, "The Norse in the East did not merely assimilate, they redefined the meaning of rulership and territory in the Slavic world. This fusion was most visible in language and elite identity. While Norse personal names dominated in the earliest records, Rurik, Oleg, Igor, within a generation they began to adopt Slavic titles and customs. This process, described by scholars as cultural creolization, did not signal immediate Norse disappearance, but rather adaptation. The warrior elite maintained Scandinavian burial customs and weapons well into the 10th century, even as they married into Slavic nobility and adopted local languages. Runestones found in Sweden further illuminate this eastward migration. Many commemorate the deaths of young men who never returned from Ostervägar, the Eastern Way. Places like Gardariki, the land of towns, appear frequently in these inscriptions, a Norse term often equated with the Slavic lands around Novgorod and Kiev. Peter Heather, professor of medieval history at King's College, London, notes, "The runestones of Sweden speak to a generation of men for whom the East was a land of opportunity and death." Economic motivations drove much of this expansion. Viking settlements in the West had been shaped by land, hunger, and raiding. In the East, it was commerce that defined Varangian activity. They moved amber, wax, honey, and most crucially, slaves downriver in exchange for silver dirhams minted in Baghdad and often found hoarded in Gotland and other parts of Scandinavia. Thomas S. Noonan, professor of history and anthropology from University of Minnesota, writes, "Rus's silver hoards are a direct record of a vast commercial engine driven by the demand of the Islamic world. Yet, it was not all trade. From the very beginning, tribute and coercion were key tools of Rus's rule. The chronicle notes that the Varangians took tribute from the Slavs and Chuds, often violently. This duality, merchant and marauder, defined their presence. The complex geography of the region also played a role. The river portage system required deep local knowledge and political negotiation. In many ways, the early Russes functioned as intermediaries, both culturally and commercially, between steppe and forest, between Christendom and Islam, between Scandinavia and Byzantium. Archaeological finds from Gniozdovo, Staraya Ladoga, and Novgorod confirm the existence of bustling trading settlements with mixed populations, combining Scandinavian, Slavic, and Finnic elements. Norse-style weapons and jewelry appear alongside Slavic ceramics and Byzantine coins. The burial grounds of these communities show both inhumation and cremation, a clear sign of overlapping traditions. By the early 10th century, the Russes had begun to establish diplomatic relations with Byzantium itself. In 911, a treaty was signed between Oleg and Emperor Leo VI. This pact secured trading privileges, legal protections, and provisions for Varangian mercenary service in the Byzantine military. The Russes' elite had become recognized actors on the world stage. Angeliki E. Liu, former professor of Byzantine history at Harvard University, notes, "The Russes emerged as a political force not merely by conquest, but by embedding themselves in the diplomatic economy of Byzantium." By the time of Prince Igor and his widow Olga, Kievan Rus had shifted from a loose Norse tribal colony into a true regional power. But the eastward journey of the Varangians was far from over. Beyond commerce, beyond conquest, lay new encounters. With Islam, with wealth unimaginable, and with a culture unlike anything seen in Scandinavia. Next, we follow the silver trails to Baghdad and explore how Norsemen from Gotland and Kiev came face to face with the Abbasid Caliphate. They came not to conquer, but to trade, yet the impact of their presence rippled across two continents. Before the Crusades, before Marco Polo, there was another link between Europe and the Islamic world, a northern one, forged not by diplomats, but by tattooed traders from the forest of Rus. Few remember it, but behind every hoard of silver buried in Swedish soil lies a forgotten connection to Baghdad. By the early 9th century, a remarkable transformation was underway in Eurasia. While Western Europe reeled from Viking raids and fragmented polities, the Abbasid Caliphate, headquartered in Baghdad, stood as the most powerful cultural and economic force in the world. A metropolis of learning, wealth, and innovation, Baghdad was not only the political capital of Islam, but also its commercial heart, drawing in goods from China, India, East Africa, and, curiously, Northern Europe. Into this world entered the Rus, Norse-speaking traders who had by now established themselves in the riverine corridors of Eastern Europe. Their motivation was clear: silver. The Abbasid economy, unlike the gold-based systems of Byzantium or the barter-heavy structures of Northern Europe, was silver-driven. Silver dirhams, minted in Samarra and Baghdad, became the most coveted currency in the Viking world. Thomas S. Noonan notes, Islamic silver fueled the Viking Age. The dirham was not just a coin, it was a catalyst. The Volga trade route became the primary axis of this exchange, beginning near Novgorod and passing through key trading centers like Gnezdovo and Bulgar on the Middle Volga. The route connected the Baltic Sea with the Caspian Sea and, by extension, with the Abbasid world. Archaeological evidence supports the scale of this trade. Over 85,000 Islamic silver coins, many from the 9th and 10th centuries, have been discovered in Scandinavia, especially in Gotland, the Swedish island that served as a linchpin for Eastern trade. Neil Price is a professor in the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History at Uppsala University in Sweden. In his monumental work on Viking history, Children of Ash and Elm, from 2020, he wrote, "The sheer volume of dirhams found in Sweden suggests not occasional contact, but an entrenched, long-term economic relationship." But this relationship was not one of equals. The Abbasids regarded the northern peoples as barbaric but useful, suppliers of fur, amber, and above all, slaves. The Rus, for their part, had little interest in cultural assimilation. Their interest was transactional, and they were willing to trade not just goods, but human lives. The Arab geographer Ibn Khordadbeh, writing in the 9th century, notes that the Russes would travel down the Volga with furs, swords, and Slavic slaves, which they sold in Muslim markets. From Baghdad, these slaves were dispersed throughout the caliphate, serving in households, armies, and labor sectors. This economic foundation underpinned a more complex cultural contact, exemplified best by the 10th century Arab envoy Ahmad ibn Fadlan. Dispatched in 921 to 922 on a diplomatic mission from Baghdad to the Volga Bulgars, Ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Rus's merchants along the river. His account, preserved in the Risala, remains the most vivid primary source we possess about the Russes from an external observer. Ibn Fadlan's observations are both fascinated and appalled. He describes the Rus as tall, strong, and physically striking. "I have never seen more perfect physical specimens, tall as palm trees, with blonde hair and ruddy skin. Each man has an axe, a sword, and a knife, and never leaves them." He comments extensively on their hygiene, their religious rituals, and most famously, their funerary practices. Ibn Fadlan witnessed the ship cremation of a Rus's chieftain, a ritual involving animal sacrifice, alcohol consumption, and the death of a female slave intended to accompany her master into the afterlife. Though often sensationalized in later Western interpretations, Ibn Fadlan's testimony remains central for understanding how the Norse culture was perceived by the Islamic world. James Montgomery is Sir Thomas Adams's Professor of Arabic at University of Cambridge. Fadlan's account does not merely describe the Rus, it positions them in a moral geography suspended between barbarity and fascination. Not all encounters were peaceful. As the Rus grew wealthier and bolder, some groups abandoned the trading model in favor of direct raiding. In 913, a fleet of 500 Rus' ships sailed across the Caspian Sea and attacked the Iranian coast near Gorgan, plundering towns and enslaving inhabitants. On their return journey, however, they were ambushed by Khazar forces, allies of the Abbasids. Most were killed or enslaved in turn. A second expedition in 943 saw the Ruses capture Barda, the capital of the region of Aran, modern Azerbaijan. There they remained for several months, wreaking havoc until an outbreak of dysentery forced their withdrawal. Jonathan Shepherd in The Emergence of Ruses writes, "The campaigns of 913 and 943 illustrate the duality of Ruses' expansion, economic penetration coupled with opportunistic violence." These violent encounters should not obscure the broader picture. Most Rus' contact with the Islamic world was economic, not military. By the late 10th century, Scandinavian presence in the Volga basin declined, coinciding with the Christianization of Kievan Rus in 988 under Vladimir the Great. As Orthodox Christianity replaced Norse paganism and Byzantine models of governance replaced tribal structures, the need for long-distance expeditions decreased. Yet the legacy of this contact endured. The silver from Baghdad not only fueled the Scandinavian economy, it helped finance state building in Eastern Europe. Kievan Rus, unlike its Western Viking contemporaries in England or Normandy, was not just a military enterprise. It was a commercial civilization forged in the intersection between Norse ambition and Islamic prosperity. Florin Curta, in The Making of the Slavs, notes, "The Rus' connection to the Islamic world is one of the most understudied pillars of medieval globalization. By the dawn of the 11th century, the great silver caravans had begun to fade. The Abbasid Caliphate itself was in decline, and new regional powers emerged. But the memory of the Rus lingered in the dirhams buried beneath Swedish fields, in the Arab chronicles of tattooed giants, and in the Slavic cities they helped raise. In the next chapter, we follow the Varangians into Byzantium, where they would trade their axes for imperial coin and become not conquerors or merchants, but bodyguards to emperors. When the Varangians first appeared at Constantinople's gates, they came as enemies, rowers in dragon ships carrying axes and fire. A century later, they stood at those same gates as protectors, not invaders, sword-bearers to the emperor himself. How did a people once labelled as barbaroi become the elite warriors of the most sophisticated empire on earth? In the year 860, Byzantine chroniclers record a sudden, brutal attack on the outskirts of Constantinople. The Rus, under the leadership of Askold and Dir, had descended from the north, sailing down the Dnieper River, across the Black Sea, and into the imperial heartlands. Their ships, light and shallow-keeled, were optimized for rivers, but capable of navigating open water when needed. The raid shocked the empire. The Byzantine world had encountered many enemies, but the Rus were different. They were not a unified nation, nor the agents of a single king. They were a confederation of armed entrepreneurs, driven by profit and reputation. Their arrival marked the beginning of a complex and often contradictory relationship between the Rus and Byzantium, one that would alternate between war and alliance, plunder and oath. The life of St. George of Amastris is 9th century Byzantine hagiography, possibly referring to the 860 raid. It states, "They came down the Dnieper River in monoxyla, swift ships carved from single tree trunks, and surrounded the city. The people of Constantinople fled in fear." This early phase was marked by aggression. The Rus' Byzantine wars of 860, 907 and 941 brought violence and fear to the empire's northern frontier. The 911 treaty, however, represented a turning point. Signed under Prince Oleg, this document regulated trade, guaranteed rights for Rus' merchants in Constantinople, and granted them legal standing under Byzantine law, a remarkable concession. Jonathan Shepherd, in his book Byzantine Foreign Policy 1000 to 1071, notes, "The treaty reveals a dual identity. These Norsemen were not only raiders and warriors, but negotiators, diplomats, and intermediaries. The empire recognized them because it could not ignore them. The military relationship soon followed. By the early 10th century, Varangians began entering imperial service as mercenaries. Their reputation for loyalty, fearlessness, and martial discipline made them ideal candidates. Initially irregular auxiliaries, they evolved into an elite formation. The Varangian Guard, Tagmaton Varangon, a permanent unit of foreign-born soldiers whose sole allegiance lay with the emperor. Formally established under Emperor Basil II in the late 10th century, the Guard recruited heavily from Scandinavia, primarily Sweden, but also Denmark and Norway. The men who joined were often younger sons, exiled warriors, or those seeking wealth abroad. The Västgötalagen, a 13th century Swedish law code, even had to forbid men from claiming inheritance, while in Greece, a euphemism for Byzantine service, suggesting the mass scale of enlistment. Angeliki E. Laiu, in her book The Economic History of Byzantium, notes their loyalty was not to the shifting factions of Constantinople, but to the throne itself. In a court riddled with intrigue, their foreignness was a safeguard, and in battle, their ferocity made them a terror to enemies and allies alike. The Guard quickly became more than a military unit. It was a symbol of imperial reach, of wealth, and of martial discipline. The Varangians were often deployed at critical moments, not in large-scale battles, but as shock troops, rear guards, and bodyguards during coups or invasions. Their weapons were distinctive. Massive axes, sometimes over a metre in length, and chainmail armour adorned with Norse symbols or dragons. Accounts describe the Varangians as tall, fair-haired, and often visibly distinct from other Byzantine units. Their discipline and theatrical appearance were not accidental. In the ritual, heavy world of Constantinople, performance and loyalty were as vital as martial prowess. Michael Sellos, 11th century Byzantine courtier and historian, writes, "They would die to the last man rather than flee, and in the hour of battle they were like a wall of iron." One of the most telling accounts comes from the Chronicle of John Skylitzes, an illustrated manuscript from the 12th century that contains some of the earliest known depictions of the Guard. In it, Varangians are seen wielding great axes and standing in formation during key moments, guarding emperors, storming fortresses and executing traitors. In times of peace, the Guard functioned as ceremonial guards at court, often guarding the Chrysotriklinos, the imperial audience chamber. When emperors died, it was often the Varangians who oversaw the transfer of power and protected the succession process. Their oath-bound loyalty was seen as incorruptible. Despite their formal allegiance to Byzantium, the Varangians retained traces of their Scandinavian identity. Some brought their own runemasters to carve commemorative stones upon their return. In Sweden, the so-called Greece Runestones reference journeys to Miklagardr, the Old Norse name for Constantinople. The runestone U161, now the coat of arms of Täby municipality in Sweden, bears a Byzantine cross and memorializes a man named Ulf who had served in the East. Another runestone describes Ragnvaldr, a captain of the Guard, returning to Sweden and raising a stone in memory of his mother. Peter Heather notes, "The runestones are echoes of identity. They speak of glory, distance, and death. In these carvings, Constantinople was not just a city, it was a rite of passage." Over time, the Guard evolved. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, many Anglo-Saxons fled their homeland and found refuge in Constantinople. From the late 11th century onward, the Guard became increasingly Anglo-Saxon in character, with former English nobles and warriors joining its ranks. This shift did not erase the unit's foundational character, but added new layers. Both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons shared a tradition of oath-bound warrior service, and many were united by a common enemy: the Normans, whose expansion had displaced them. The Varangian Guard remained a critical force until the 13th century. It fought in the Battle of Dyrrhachium, 1081, helped suppress rebellions, and played a key role in the defense of imperial authority. However, with the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204, the Guard's importance declined. Some remnants survived in the restored empire, but their role was never the same. Yet even in decline, their image persisted. Norsemen in imperial service, wielding axes for a foreign emperor in a city of marble domes and golden icons. In the ruins of Hagia Sophia, runic inscriptions, simple carvings from anonymous Varangians, remain etched into the marble balustrades. The journey of the Varangians into Byzantium reveals a deeper truth, that the Viking world was never defined by isolation or barbarity. It was a mobile, adaptive, and outward-facing culture, capable of reshaping itself to suit the needs of empire. But as Byzantium's power waned and Kievan Rus Christianized, the Varangians disappeared from the chronicles. Their legacy passed not into myth, but into memory, carved in stone, told in foreign tongues, and buried beneath layers of forgotten silver. Next, we turn to the afterlife of this encounter, how Varangian memory, Norse identity, and Slavic statehood evolved in the centuries after the Viking Age ended. They came to plunder, to trade, to rule, and for 2 centuries they did. But what happens to a people who win? The Varangians shaped the very foundation of Rus, guarded emperors in Byzantium, and mapped the rivers of the East in blood and silver. Then they vanished, not with a final battle or a fall, but in silence, in marriages, baptisms, and forgotten graves. This is the story of how the Vikings faded from the East, not through defeat, but through assimilation. By the early 11th century, the Viking Age had reached its zenith and its turning point. The dramatic rise of the Kievan Rus, the maturation of Byzantine diplomacy, and the consolidation of Islamic powers all contributed to a shifting political landscape. In the East, the Norsemen, who had once terrorized Constantinople and profited from Baghdad's silver, now found themselves transformed. The world that had welcomed or resisted them no longer saw them as outsiders. They had become princes, merchants, Christians, and, in the eyes of their descendants, Slavs. Jonathan Shepherd, in The Emergence of Rus, from 750 to 1200, writes, "The Viking story in the East is not one of abrupt ends or dramatic collapse. It is a narrative of diffusion, of gradual absorption, where names, practices, and memories outlived identities. The Norsemen did not vanish. They became invisible by becoming essential." The most symbolic moment of this transition occurred in 988 AD, when Prince Vladimir of Kiev embraced Christianity, aligning his state with Orthodox Byzantium. This act, often interpreted as political strategy, was also a cultural watershed. The Christianization of Rus marked the formal rejection of Norse paganism, and with it, the last vestiges of Viking distinctiveness in the region. Scandinavian burials, once elaborate affairs featuring ship interments, weapons, and ritual cremations, became rarer. Grave goods diminished. Pagan symbolism gave way to crosses, icons, and church bells. Simon Franklin, in his book Writing, Society and Culture in Early Rus, described those events. Christianization did not erase the Norse presence, it recontextualized it. Conversion brought new systems of memory, chronicles, saints' lives, liturgies. The Varangians, once remembered through rune and oral poetry, now entered history through the pen of monks. The Norse elite, originally distinguished by names like Rurik, Oleg, and Igor, increasingly bore Slavic or Christian names: Vladimir, Sviatoslav, Yaroslav. Their legitimacy no longer came from Norse descent or martial prowess, but from their participation in Christian kingship, marriage alliances, and ecclesiastical patronage. Yet the memory of their origins persisted in subtle forms. In Sweden, a remarkable form of historical memory survives: the Varangian Runestones. Carved between the 10th and early 12th centuries, these stones commemorate journeys to Greece, Byzantium, Sirkland, the Islamic world, and Gardariki, Rus's lands. Most were raised by family members of those who died in foreign service. Some were erected by the men themselves upon returning home. One of the most striking is the Ed runestone U112, which reads, "Ragnvaldr had this stone raised in memory of his mother. He was in Greece, was captain of the guard." This inscription, referencing Ragnvald's role in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, exemplifies how personal and geopolitical histories intertwined. Neil Price furthermore notes, "These stones do not mourn defeat. They celebrate participation in a world far beyond Scandinavia, in battles, rituals, and empires. They are both eulogy and announcement. We were there." Yet these runestones also mark a threshold. The youngest belonged to the early 12th century, by which point the custom had begun to fade. The decline of runic literacy and the rise of Christianity's textual traditions shifted how memory was constructed. Oral sagas and engraved stones gave way to monastic chronicles and saints' vitae. In Byzantium, too, the Varangians began to blend into the imperial fabric. After the Norman conquest of England, many Anglo-Saxon warriors joined the Varangian Guard. Over time, the Guard itself evolved, from a Scandinavian elite to a broader Germanic-speaking unit. By the late 13th century, its distinctly Norse character was largely lost, though Icelandic annals still remembered Constantinople as Mikla Gardr. The question of whether the Varangians disappeared or assimilated has long occupied scholars. The answer depends on how identity is measured. If one looks for language, ritual, or burial practice, the Varangians fade quickly, but if one examines institutions, governance, and historical memory, their legacy becomes undeniable. Peter Heather, in his book Empires and Barbarians, writes, "The Rurikid dynasty, which ruled Russes for centuries, was built on Varangian foundations, yet its kings ceased to be Norse in anything but genealogy. This is not a loss. It is the success of state-building, where ethnic origin gives way to political legitimacy. By the mid-11th century, the Scandinavian influx into Russes had largely ended. The routes down the Volga and Dnieper were no longer filled with Varangian traders. Instead, Russes' princes sent envoys and armies along them. The political center had shifted from Varangian raiders to Slavic Christian monarchs. What remains of the Varangians is found not in identity but in historiography, in how others wrote them into history. The primary chronicle, compiled in the early 12th century, frames the Varangians as founders. Rurik is portrayed not as a foreign conqueror, but as the chosen prince of the people, a bringer of order. Yet this retrospective view masks the messiness of cultural contact. The chronicle, written by Christian monks, smooths over the pagan past, the violence of conquest, and the contradictions of assimilation. Florin Curta, in The Making of the Slavs, writes, "The chronicle's depiction of the Varangians is as much about 12th century identity as it is about 9th century events. In remembering them as legitimate founders, it sanctifies the existing order. Myth becomes history, conquest becomes inheritance. This transformation from outsider to founder, from pagan to proto-Christian, reflects the larger narrative of medieval state formation. The Vikings, who once stood outside Christendom's moral universe, had become part of its political architecture. By the time Ibn Battuta passed through the steppes in the 14th century, the Varangians were no longer mentioned. Their axes, once feared in Byzantium, had given way to the swords of Slavic princes and the doctrines of Orthodox monks. Yet in the stone of Sweden, the marble of Hagia Sophia, and the pages of the Chronicle, their memory endured. They did not leave ruins nor a written literature of their own, but they left behind structures, political, military, and cultural, that persisted. The end of the Viking Age in the East was not a collapse. It was a transformation, from raiders to rulers, from pagans to Orthodox Christians, from Norsemen to Slavs. The Varangians became part of the very worlds they once disrupted. In the end, their greatest conquest was not territory, but legacy. The Norsemen who entered the East came as foreigners, armed with axes, trading furs and silver, strangers to the land and the faith. But centuries later, the states they helped build would become kingdoms. Their dynasties would claim divine right. Their memory would become origin myth. How did a people who left so few written words end up shaping the political DNA of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the imperial guard of Byzantium? By the beginning of the 12th century, the Varangians, as a distinct political or ethnic entity, had all but disappeared from the Eastern European landscape. Their customs were absorbed, their language forgotten, and their names transformed. Yet their legacy endured, etched not in surviving communities, but in the foundations of statehood, in the architecture of memory, and in the political culture of medieval and modern Eastern Europe. Jonathan Shepherd, historian from the University of Cambridge, explains, "The Varangians stand at the intersection of memory and myth. They were not just actors in early medieval politics, but symbols shaped by chroniclers, mobilized by rulers, and claimed by nations. Their role as both real and imagined founders of Rus was politically useful and therefore historically lasting." The primary chronicle, written in the early 12th century, provides the earliest and most influential version of the Varangian legacy. According to this account, the Rus, a group of Norse origin, were invited by the Slavic tribes to bring order to their land. Rurik, the legendary chieftain, establishes rule in Novgorod, and his descendants expand south to Kiev, forming what would become Kievan Rus. While modern historians approach this narrative with caution, its enduring impact cannot be overstated. The chronicle does not merely record history, it constructs a foundational myth, one in which foreign leadership is legitimized through invitation, order, and continuity. Simon Franklin, in previous mentioned book Writing, Society and Culture in Early Russes, writes, "The chronicle story of Rurik is not ethnography, it is ideology. It provides a genealogy for authority, justifying dynastic rule by embedding it in the past and by locating that past in the hands of outsiders who became insiders." The Rurikid dynasty, which ruled parts of Eastern Europe until the late 16th century, anchored its authority in this narrative. Whether or not Rurik existed as described, his symbolic presence provided a frame of legitimacy. From Vladimir the Great to Yaroslav the Wise, Rus's rulers invoked their Varangian descent not to appear foreign, but to assert a lineage of power, stability, and martial strength. The Varangian impact was not limited to origin myths. In their earliest phases, the Norse brought with them forms of military organization, legal practice, and tribute collection that would shape the institutions of the Rus's state. Early treaties with Byzantium, such as those in 907 and 911, show evidence of structured legal codes governing Rus's merchants and soldiers, suggesting a degree of internal regulation, possibly inherited from Scandinavian legal customs. These early legal traditions in turn contributed to the formulation of the Ruskaya Pravda, Rus's law, one of the oldest Slavic law codes. Though the final form of the Pravda was compiled after the Varangian era, its framework reflects the legacy of a society governed by warrior princes, trade norms, and kinship alliances. Florin Kurta, historian from the University of Florida, writes, "The institutional memory of the Rus was shaped not solely by Slavic customs, but by the Varangian presence. Their practices of arbitration, property, and vengeance shaped the way law was remembered and applied." Moreover, the Varangians' relationship with Byzantium had lasting ideological consequences. Through their service as mercenaries and guards, they became symbols of loyal violence, barbarian strength harnessed for imperial order. The Varangian Guard, once composed of Norse warriors, became a metaphor for incorruptibility, invoked long after the Norse had vanished from its ranks. Angeliki E. Layu furthermore notes, "The Guard was not merely functional. It was symbolic, representing loyalty beyond politics, devotion to the throne rather than the court. It was the mythology of the outsider turned enforcer, a role Byzantium found repeatedly useful." As modern nation-states began constructing their own historical narratives in the 19th century, the Varangians became a contested symbol. In Russia, the Rurikid legacy was embraced as the cornerstone of imperial identity, connecting the Romanov dynasty to a mythic past of order and sovereignty. In Ukraine, the story of Kiev's early rulers became central to a national story of independence and cultural distinction, and yet both narratives relied on the same foundational myth, that the Norse had come, ruled, and then vanished, leaving behind a people and a state transformed. Peter Heather writes, "In different centuries and different regimes, the Varangians have been viewed as foreign invaders, civilizing heroes, or proto-national founders. Their true historical significance lies not in what they were, but in how they were remembered. This selective memory was visible in the iconography of power. Tsarist Russia commissioned paintings of Rurik's arrival. Soviet scholars, by contrast, downplayed the Norse element, emphasizing instead the Slavic roots of Kievan Rus. In Scandinavia, the eastern journeys of the Vikings became part of national folklore, celebrated in runestones, museums, and historical reenactments. In Sweden, the Greece runestones and Cirkland stones remain among the most tangible relics of the Varangian age. These stones, many erected in the 11th century, commemorate journeys to Byzantium and the Islamic world. Their language is Norse, but their references are global. They describe service in Miklagardr, mention commanders of the Varangian Guard, and occasionally lament the loss of sons who met death in Cirkland. Neil Price, in his monumental work Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "These inscriptions are not mere personal memorials. They are public performances of memory embedded in a landscape that the men left behind. They narrate not only death, but worldliness, declaring that even the smallest village was connected to Constantinople." Even in Constantinople itself, the Norse left their mark. In the upper galleries of Hagia Sophia, faint runic inscriptions can still be seen, scratched into the stone by anonymous Varangians. They do not record theology or politics. One simply reads, "Halvdan was here." It is a stark contrast to the grandeur of the basilica, a pagan name etched quietly into Christian marble. Yet it speaks volumes. The story of the Varangians in the East ends not in conquest or destruction, but in transformation. They are among history's most successful intermediaries, founders who left no manifestos, soldiers who wrote no chronicles, kings whose names dissolved into other languages. But their impact remains in the laws of Kievan Rus, in the swords of the Byzantine emperors, in the runestones of Sweden, in the chronicles of monks, and in the contested myths of modern nations. In the final segment of our journey, we return to the rivers that shaped this world, to reflect on what the Varangians truly were. Not merely Vikings in a foreign land, but the bridge between civilizations, between paganism and Christendom, between the forest and the steppe, between Scandinavia and empire. Join us as we draw this saga to a close and explore the historical meaning of the Eastern Viking age. The Viking Age did not end in a blaze of glory. It faded quietly along the rivers of the East. There was no last stand, no final voyage, just silence. But perhaps that is the wrong way to think about endings. What if the real legacy of the Vikings in the East is not what they destroyed, but what they connected, created, and left behind? For over 2 centuries, Norse warriors, merchants, and mercenaries journeyed along the Volga and Dnieper, from the pine forests of Scandinavia to the marble palaces of Constantinople and the minarets of Baghdad. They did not build cathedrals or empires in their own name. They did not leave written chronicles, yet their presence shaped the medieval world in fundamental ways. The Varangians, a term at once specific and evolving, acted as connectors between the Islamic caliphates and Christian empires, between forest tribes and steppe nomads, between the pagan past and the Christian future. Jonathan Shepherd writes, "To write the history of Eastern Europe without the Varangians is to omit the ferryman of its political and cultural transformation. Their ships carried more than goods. They carried institutions, identities, and the rhythms of diplomacy and violence." Historians have often asked whether the Varangians were more than middlemen, whether they imposed real political structures or merely exploited existing ones. But this binary misses the point. Their role was less about domination than intermediation. They built bridges where previously there were barriers. In Kievan Rus, they imported a hierarchical form of rulership rooted in Norse traditions of elite leadership, fused it with Slavic kinship structures, and later submitted it to Byzantine models of kingship and Christian ethics. The result was not a transplant, but a hybrid political culture, one that endured well beyond their visible presence. The geography of the Eastern Viking Age was defined by rivers, not frontiers. These were open systems, ever shifting, subject to seasonal rhythms and political tides. The Volga, Dniester, and Dnieper were not mere trade routes. They were corridors of culture where Slavic, Turkic, Norse, and Byzantine worlds met. At key nodes, Novgorod, Kiev, Gnezdovo, Staraya Ladoga, Varangians facilitated more than economic exchange. They enabled cultural contact. They introduced not only silver and weapons, but forms of storytelling, funeral rites, and iconography. Over time, these layered into the evolving identities of the Rus's peoples. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, notes, "The Norsemen did not bring civilization to the east, but they brought motion, and motion brought transformation. They destabilized, but they also connected." In a medieval world of slow movement and local identities, this alone was revolutionary. The Viking ships that sailed east carried amber, furs, and slaves, but they also carried possibility. A man born in Gotland could die fighting for the Byzantine Emperor. A youth in Kiev could be buried with Norse weapons and a Christian cross. These lives defy neat categories, and that perhaps is the true character of the Eastern Viking experience. The silence that surrounds the final phase of the Varangian story is partly one of historiography. As Kievan Rus's adopted Orthodox Christianity and Byzantine bureaucratic forms, it no longer recorded Norse deeds or distinctions. The chronicle's narrative shifts. Pagan chieftains give way to pious princes. Genealogy replaces geography. But the memory did not vanish, it simply changed form. In Sweden, runestones tell of men who died in Cirkland or served in Greece. In Constantinople, runic graffiti carved into marble columns remain mute but eloquent. In Slavic law codes, echoes of Norse practice linger. In conceptions of Vergild, property, and kinship, Simon Franklin adds, "Historical silence is not absence, it is transformation." The Varangians disappeared from the record not because they were erased, but because they were absorbed into new categories of rulership, faith, and law. The assimilation of the Varangians into Slavic society was not erasure, it was success. They became what they had once ruled. Intermarriage, shared military campaigns, and religious conversion blurred the lines between Varangian and Slav, foreigner and founder. Peter Heather notes, in the end, the Varangians ceased to be visible because they had succeeded. Their names changed, their gods faded, but their structures endured, in dynasties, in cities, in memories. Modern scholarship emphasizes the fluidity of identity in the medieval world. People did not see themselves in fixed ethnic categories, but in terms of allegiance, family, faith, and opportunity. The Varangians exemplify this. They were Norse by origin, Slavic by adoption, and imperial by service. Their story complicates modern nationalist historiography, which seeks neat origins and clean boundaries. The Rurikid dynasty, descended symbolically or actually from the Varangians, ruled large parts of Eastern Europe until the early modern period. Its longevity is a testament to the success of the political model the Varangians helped shape. Princely rule bound by oaths, legitimacy anchored in military power, and later sacralized through Christian kingship. Later, Russian imperial ideology would look back to the Varangians as founders, especially under the Romanovs, who styled themselves as heirs to both Kiev and Byzantium. The Varangian legacy thus extended not only through bloodlines, but through myth-making, iconography, and state ideology. Florin Curta concludes, history remembers the Varangians because states chose to remember them. They were written into the origin stories of empires, not because they were first, but because they were useful. And yet, that usefulness points to a deeper truth, their role as agents of transformation. To speak of the Eastern Viking Age is to speak of a world that defies modern categories. It was neither wholly Scandinavian nor Slavic, neither pagan nor Christian, neither empire nor tribe. It was a world in motion. The Varangians brought with them violence, ambition, and cunning, but also structure, ritual, and roots. They navigated a volatile frontier between civilizations, and in doing so, helped to create new ones. Their story is not one of conquest alone, nor of decline. It is a story of transformation, not just of peoples and powers, but of identity itself. Paul Stevenson, in his monumental work, Byzantium's Balkan Frontier, observes, The Varangians were not the beginning of Russia, nor were they a footnote to Byzantium. They were something more elusive, a hinge, a moving part in the great machinery of medieval Eurasia. Their world was the river, and like the river, they left a path, not a monument. As we leave the rivers of the East behind, we carry with us the traces of those who rode them, forgotten names, carved stones, silver coins, and the faint impression of axes laid down for crowns. The Eastern Viking Age was never a place. It was a process, a bridge between gods and emperors, tribes and states, memory and myth. In the next and final section, we draw this journey to a close and ask, what does it mean to remember the Varangians today? They came with no flag, no empire followed in their wake, no chronicles bear their voices. And yet, the Varangians changed the world. From the pine-cloaked shores of Sweden to the palaces of Constantinople and the markets of Baghdad, they moved not as conquerors but as connectors. They did not leave kingdoms behind. They left roots, institutions and myths. They passed through Slavic forests, Byzantine courts and Islamic cities, never fully belonging but always shaping. Their story is not just one of raids and riches. It is the story of what lies between war and diplomacy, between paganism and Christianity, between the tribal and the imperial. It is a story that reminds us that history is rarely made by permanence, but by movement. The Eastern Viking Age did not end. It was absorbed. Its people faded not in defeat, but in legacy. And even today, their shadow lingers, in coins unearthed in Gotland, in runes etched into Hagia Sophia's stone, and in the stories we tell about who we are and where we come from. If this journey through the Eastern Viking world gave you a new perspective on history, subscribe for more stories that cross borders and eras. And if you want to explore what happened next, how Kievan Rus has evolved, how Byzantium fell, and how memory became myth, watch our other series on the rise of the Orthodox Slavic world and the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. Because sometimes, to understand how nations rise, we must follow the rivers back to where they began. This was the Eastern Viking Saga.